Class, welcome to Sociology class for Tuesday, September 1st lecture. So today we're going to jump into the text and we're going to be in chapter 1 of your book. And so if you have the second edition, it's chapter 1, and if you have the older edition, it's also chapter 1. So we're going to be answering the question about what is sociology. So I'm going to give a brief overview and then we're going to watch a video, Nicole's video on introducing us to sociology, and then I will talk to you a little bit about the discussion post in the assignment. So what is sociology? Well, simply put, it is just the science of society. It's the study of society. And sociology actually didn't come around until the Industrial Revolution. So if you think all the way back to the Dark Ages, which would be medieval times, like with castles and kings and queens, the authority, the final authority, was the church. And so people didn't need to study anything because the church had the final say. So if people had a question about what was right or what was wrong, or what to do in society, or how to handle certain things, the answer was always the church. So then you fast forward a couple hundred years and you get into the Industrial Revolution, where things are booming and factories are popping up and people are working and building cities and building communities. Along with that revolution, which was really good on the one hand, but it also created a lot of problems. So if you look on I'm on page 4 of the second edition. But if you look at that picture of the Industrial Revolution, some of the problems that popped up with such a big boom are things like homelessness, crime, child labor. So society all of a sudden had to look at a way, well, how do we address these problems? We can't let them go unchecked, violence, poverty, all those types of things. So out of that was born sociology, which is, how do societies function, and how do societies function well, and what contributes to the breakdown of a society? So there's a couple things that sociology is not that I want to make sure we touch on. So I'm moving into page 5 here in the second edition. But sociology is not theology or philosophy. It has nothing to do with religion. So it might study how certain societies engage in religion and how it affects that society, but it's not going to answer philosophical or theological questions. Sociology will use science to describe how things are, not the way they should be. It's a science, so it's looking at what can be seen, what can be observed. Sociology is also not an art. It's based on the scientific method. So again, it's just what we can observe, what we see happening in societies. And really importantly, sociology is not psychology. It is part of the social sciences, but here's the difference. Psychology is interpersonal. It's the study of people inside their mind, their thoughts, their feelings, why they do what they do. Whereas sociology is intrapersonal, meaning it looks at the relationship between people, and it looks at the relationship between people and society. Sociology is what happens between individuals on a one-on-one level, and then also on a bigger scale of between an individual and their neighborhood, their community, and their world. So psychology is that interpersonal, just one person, and sociology is the study of the intrapersonal, the relationships between people. Okay, so skipping ahead to the assumptions of a sociological perspective, and I'll give you a hint, this is going to be your question, your discussion question for this week, is giving examples about related to these assumptions. But the first one is the assumption that sociology makes is that human beings are social in nature. So you might think, well, I don't like to be around people. I'd rather be alone. That doesn't necessarily make you not a social creature. So think about it when you were first born. You relied on somebody, whether it was a parent or a foster parent or a caregiver, to feed you. You didn't make it this far in life without having somebody feed you and change your diaper and teach you how to stay safe and cross the road without getting hit by a car. So in that sense, we are social creatures in that we need other people to survive. And then when you got older, you needed family, you needed teachers, you needed coaches, you needed supervisors to kind of guide you and show you, hey, this is how you learn the job so that you could earn a paycheck. So no matter where you've gone in life, even if you prefer to be left alone, we are social and we do need other people to interact with and survive with. The second sociological assumption is that society changes people. So you might think, well, I do what I want, I don't answer to anybody, society doesn't influence me. Well, think about, in general, the laws. So we have laws, we have sanctions, whether they're formal or informal. We'll get more into this later in a different chapter. But society has rules that we have to follow. And if we don't follow those rules, we're punished. So think about it. The very fact that you don't want to get arrested and go to jail for stealing means that you are falling in line with what society is telling you is right or wrong. So whether we like it or not, and that's debatable and we can talk about that, society changes us. On the flip side, we have the power to change society. We don't have to be a Martin Luther King Jr. or a Gandhi to change society, although they did on a large scale. But just you being you within your family, within your school, at your job, you influence somebody else, whether for the good or the bad. So therefore, people change society. And that's actually a really hopeful thing to know, that you have the power to make change, whether it's on a small scale or a large scale. So that's kind of sociology. What is sociology in a nutshell? But let's turn to Nicole and watch her video for a few minutes. She has some good things to say and she is quite funny. So let's watch her for a few minutes here and see how she can add to the conversation.
I'm Nicole Sweeney, and I have a question for you. Have you ever wondered how the world works? I'm not talking about atoms and molecules or wave functions and chemical reactions. I mean the world of people.
You can manage your team's work easily with Monday.com. Just go to Monday.com and start tracking any.
For example, have you ever wondered who goes to college and why? What is it that makes people march in the streets? How do you know to raise your hand in math class but not at the dinner table? Why do some people like Broadway musicals and some people like hip hop and some people like both? Well, we're gonna find out about all of that stuff and so much more. Especially you. You're gonna learn about you and your place in the world because this is Crash Course Sociology. Sociology got its start thanks to a French philosopher named Auguste Comte in the 1800s. He wanted there to be a systematic science for studying society, a way to investigate and solve its basic problems. And while sociology today is very different from what Comte imagined, that's still kind of what it is. Sociology is the scientific study of society and human behavior. But isn't society this great big thing? I mean, society is whole cities, it's the economy, it's politics, and what does all of that have to do with raising your hand at the dinner table? A lot, as it turns out. A society is just a group of people who share a culture and a territory, and culture is in everything, from the biggest questions in politics to the smallest interactions between people. So yes, society is big, but it's also very small. Want to see how? Let's go to the thought bubble. Imagine you're sitting alone in your room singing along to your favorite Broadway show at the top of your lungs. Not another person in sight. Society isn't anywhere to be found, except that it is. Even if you ignore the house that you're in and the parents, siblings, or roommates you're probably bothering while you're singing so horribly, there's still the song that you're singing and the music that goes with it. Those things, along with literally every object in the room that you didn't make yourself, are all products of society. And you might be all alone when you're belting out Hamilton, but you weren't alone when a friend first introduced you to the musical and its songs. And for that matter, your taste in music isn't purely yours either. What kind of music you like can be influenced by anything from what you were exposed to as a kid, to what your friends like now, to what neighborhood you grew up in, or what schools you went to. Society is tricky. It gets in places you might not expect. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So when we say that sociology is the study of society and human behavior, that means that sociology is incredibly broad. In fact, it may be the broadest of what we call the social sciences. The social sciences include disciplines like economics and psychology, and while they all have different focuses and perspectives, they're all trying to understand the social world objectively through controlled and repeated observation. So what makes sociology different from any of these other social sciences? Well, like the others, sociology is looking for patterns, recurring characteristics or events. But it looks for all kinds of patterns in all kinds of places. Sociology looks at all aspects of society and at all scales, from two people talking to differences between nations. It's this scope that really sets sociology apart, especially in what's known as the sociological perspective. And the sociological perspective means two things. One, it means seeing the general in the particular, and two, it means seeing the strange in the familiar. Seeing the general in the particular is a way of saying that sociology tries to understand social behavior by placing it in its wider social context. To go back to you belting out Broadway tunes in your room, the sociologist who overhears you from the sidewalk might notice not just your choice of what to sing, but how that individual choice may have been influenced by your class, neighborhood, race, gender, or age. To take another example, a sociologist might not care whether or not you in particular decide to get married, but she might be interested in learning more about a declining marriage rate in your society and say what's causing it and whether it's having any societal impacts. Or maybe she's more interested in the fact that in the US, people tend to marry partners of the same class and race as them. In both of these cases, what people sing or whom they marry, the sociologist is interested in a general pattern, a pattern composed of a massive number of particular individual choices. Each individual forms a part of the pattern, and in looking at their individual choices, a sociologist can see elements of the whole pattern, like seeing how a single stone fits into a mosaic. Seeing the strange in the familiar is the second part of the sociological perspective, and it's maybe more difficult to do. To see the strange in the familiar is to approach the everyday world as though you were seeing it for the first time, as if you were from another world. This is hard, but it's also incredibly important, and kind of cool. When we asked at the very beginning why you raised your hand to ask a question in your math class, but not at your dinner table, that's a very small example of trying to see the strange in the familiar. And this is so hard to do because your own society tends to look normal to you. You take it for granted. As you're socialized into it, you're taught a common sense understanding of society, and that's not a bad thing. After all, you need a common sense understanding of society in order to live in it, right? You need to know that you shake hands when you meet someone new, and that red means stop, and that you should try to show up on time to things. But if sociology is going to study society, it needs to be able to look at these things as strange and unfamiliar in order to really understand how they work and to uncover patterns of behavior in a culture. Common sense has to just get us through the world, but sociology has to know what's true. And this is important because a society's common sense doesn't consist only of harmless conventions like shaking hands. Just 200 years ago in the US, it was common sense that only white men were capable of participating in society. It was common sense that slavery was right and that women shouldn't be allowed to vote. These things were common sense in the same way that their opposites are taken for granted now. And the sociological perspective, seeing the general in the particular and the strange in the familiar, helps us to understand problems like this because it helps us see some of the key concepts in the study of society. Among these concepts, social location, marginalization, and power and inequality. If you imagine a map of society laying out all the different social groups and their relationships to each other, then your social location is your spot on that map. Your social location is a way of classifying yourself by race, social class, gender, sexual orientation, religion, etc. Understanding social location is important because just like the sociologist looks for the general and the particular, a person's life and choices will be influenced by their social location. This is true in a bunch of ways. Most obvious is that your social location can limit your choices. Some groups have legal rights and privileges that others don't. For instance, until a few years ago, gays and lesbians couldn't legally marry in the US, so their social location limited their choices. But social location also impacts what you learn and what you're taught about society. Whether or not you go to college, for instance, can be heavily influenced by whether the social class you grew up in tends to see college as a real or valuable possibility. And social location also affects what others have learned and are taught about you. Take, for instance, the consistent finding that resumes with names that sound African American tend to get called for interviews much less often than those with white-sounding names, even though the resumes are otherwise identical. In all these ways, social location can contribute to the marginalization of a social group. If a social group is marginalized, it means that it occupies a position outside the centers of power. Marginalized groups are often racial, ethnic, sexual, or religious minorities, and marginalized groups tend to have a clearer view of how power operates. Heterosexual people, for example, often don't recognize what a social power it is to have their relationships socially sanctioned, and
Okay, so we are going to stop right there for a little bit, and you can finish the video if you want, but I just wanted to give you another perspective as an introduction to what is sociology, okay? So let's go ahead and take a quick look at populi. Okay, let's get out of this. Oops. Okay, and then we will go into populi here, and you can go into chapter 1, what is sociology? Let me make sure I'm sharing here. Okay, here we go. All right, so what is sociology? This is the lesson, and these are actually the links to Nicole's videos right here. The video we just watched if you want to finish it, but also lesson 2 if you want to read that. They're pretty quick. Okay, so here's the lesson, and then if I want to go into the discussions, because this is what's going to be due on Thursday, I go down to discussion post week 1, and here's your question. And you can read it. It has 3 parts, so make sure you read this thoroughly. And then as a reminder, the rubric is right here, so what you're being graded on is in here. And then if I go back to the lessons, I also want to show you, if you go to files, I created for you a discussion post and response examples paper. So these are actually from a class that I'm in. And the requirements for yours are, I believe, about 200 words for your initial post and about 100 words for your responses to your peers. So if you want to read kind of what I'm looking for an initial post, this means that you've done your research as you answer the question. This isn't the same question, this is just an example. So this one's a little bit longer, but if you look here, you can kind of read my answer to a question, and I'm using my references. And then I cite my references. You need to use at least one, and it can be your textbook. And then I can go down and read somebody's response to me. So you also, by Sunday night, need to respond to 2 of your other peers' initial posts. And so your responses don't have to be as long, but they do need to be meaningful. And I share in the discussion post what I'm looking for in a response to a peer. And then she referenced something there too in her response. So I've given you a couple examples. Here's another initial post. So remember, it's going to be longer than your response to a classmate. It needs to be substantial, and you need to use a reference. So again, these are just examples, and then here's a response to this person's post, and then I have another example down here. So you have access to that under lesson 1. You also have access to it under the files, and it's called discussion, post, and response examples. So I just want to show you where you can do that and find that. So if I go back into the discussions, when I'm ready to write my discussion post, I recommend you probably do it in Word and save it. You would just go down to contribute to this discussion and make sure that you're answering all 3 of these questions and you're citing at least one source. And you can check the syllabus for more criteria on your discussion post. It's listed in the syllabus. And then in your responses, respond to at least one of the following prompts to your peers, and you have some options right here. And so you will just go into the discussion post, contribute to the discussion. If you want to do it in Word and just upload it, you can. And this is due Thursday night by 11:59 p.m. And then your responses, 2 of them, are due by Sunday night at 11:59 p.m. So I think that covers it for today's lecture. If you have any questions, make sure you post them on the dashboard. You have everything you need there in Populi in the syllabus, and you should have your text, but if not, you can also go back to the syllabus page, and you will see that chapter 1 is posted there, a PDF of it if you don't have your text. All right, I will see you in the classroom. Take care.